On Denver's coldest dawn, Maggie Carter discovers a nearly frozen bobcat kitten in her backyard. Every neighbor urges her to walk away, but something deep inside won't let her. As the blizzard grows, Maggie risks everything to save a wild life, even as hope flickers on the edge of extinction. What she learns will challenge everything you thought you knew about letting go, loving fiercely, and fighting for one more heartbeat. Where are you watching from? If this story moves you, like and subscribe for more journeys of hope and courage. On the coldest morning Denver had felt in years, Margaret Maggie Carter woke before dawn. At 62, her joints complained with every step across the kitchen tiles, but she was used to that. The pre-dawn darkness pressed against her kitchen window, painted with a fine rime of ice. She wrapped her hands around a mug of coffee, breathing in its steam as if warmth could seep from her lungs into her bones. The thermostat glowed an angry red. Ida Grazano outside, and not much better in here. Winter had staked its claim on the city, suffocating the suburb under inches of pale snow. Outside, the world was silent and sharp, the hush of snow muting every sound except for the distant, insistent howl of the wind. Maggie glanced at the pile of logs stacked by the fence. She'd have to fetch more firewood before the morning chill conquered her living room. Sighing, she tugged on her old boots, zipped up her faded coat, and stepped out.
Come on, baby, please.
Her breath pluming in the air
up.
like the exhaust of a tired steam engine. Each step crunched in the brittle snow, the cold so fierce it seemed to vibrate in her teeth. As Maggie neared the woodpile, something out of place caught her eye. A huddled, shapeless form near the fence, half buried in powder. She hesitated, squinting against the weak dawn light, her heart giving a faint, inexplicable jolt. Cautiously, she approached. At first, she thought it was just a clump of dirty snow, but as she brushed away the powder with a gloved hand, she froze. A kitten, or something close. Its fur was ruffled and streaked with frost, barely more than a shadow, no bigger than both her palms pressed together. Its body lay still, curled inward, the tiny paws stiff as twigs, eyes pinched shut against the world. For a second, she thought it might be a stray house cat, but the patterns, those black-tipped ears, tufted like paintbrushes, the faint rosettes ghosted along its tawny fur, told another story. A bobcat kitten, wild, maybe 7, 8 weeks old by the size of it. All at once, the air felt thinner. Maggie's mind flashed with a dozen warnings: diseases, parasites, rabies. What was a wild bobcat doing here, this far into suburbia? Her neighbors' voices rang out as if summoned by her unease. "It's dead already. Don't touch it. It's wild. You'll get bitten. Leave it for the coyotes." Their words echoed from across the years and fences, from every time she dared to care too much. But something inside Maggie, something stubborn and tender, refused to listen. She'd seen enough dying things in her life, enough last breaths and flickering pulses to know that hope was a dangerous thing. But sometimes it was all you had. She knelt, ignoring the bite of the cold through her jeans, her breath fogging over the tiny, motionless creature. For a moment, she just stared. The world narrowed to this trembling moment. The hush of snow, the dark skeletons of bare trees, her own thudding heartbeat, and the impossible little life before her. Was it dead? Its sides didn't move. She hovered her hand above its chest, hesitated, then pressed 2 fingers gently against its fur. So cold. Nothing at first. Not even a quiver. She pressed harder, heart sinking, but then, faint as the brush of a feather, a flicker beneath her fingertips, a heartbeat, so slow, so fragile she might have imagined it. For a second, Maggie couldn't move. The world seemed to tilt, everything that mattered balancing on that shivering pulse. Instinct warred with fear. Wild animals were unpredictable, especially when cornered. Even a kitten could scratch deep, infect a wound. But she remembered a mantra from her days in the ICU, a rule for the frozen, the comatose, the hopeless. "You're not dead until you're warm and dead." The phrase repeated in her mind, growing louder as she knelt beside the dying bobcat. Her body remembered years of urgent care, the hundreds of decisions made in seconds, the endless weighing of risk and hope. What would she want if this were a child, a pet, a patient? The wind picked up, rattling the fence, snow drifting over the kitten's limp form. If she did nothing, there was no question. Death would finish what the storm had started. Maggie's hands trembled, but she forced herself to act. She shrugged out of one glove, scooping the tiny bundle into her palms. The kitten's fur was soaked with cold, so lifeless she feared she'd break it by holding too tight. Cradling it against her chest, Maggie rose, her boots slipping on the icy path. Every step back toward her house felt urgent, a race against time. The world shrank to the weight of the bobcat pressed to her heart, to the memory of all the lives she'd saved, and the few she hadn't. Inside, the air was barely warmer, but it might as well have been summer compared to outside. She slammed the door with a shoulder, heart hammering as she hurried to the fireplace. Behind her, the voices of the neighborhood seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet determination that had carried her through decades of chaos and loss. This choice, this wild, reckless act of compassion, felt bigger than one freezing morning, bigger than the warnings of people who had never learned the price of giving up. The tiny bobcat was not dead yet. And as Maggie gathered towels, stoked the fire, and steeled herself for whatever came next, she felt the familiar ache of hope and dread coiling in her chest. Sometimes, the line between life and death is as thin as a pulse beneath two. The moment Maggie felt that faint flutter beneath her fingertips, something fundamental shifted inside her. For a heartbeat, she stood frozen in the entryway, the bobcat's limp body heavy in her arms, the chill of the outside world still clinging to her coat and hair. Years of instinct pressed at her temples, guiding her actions even as uncertainty gnawed at her resolve. There was no time for second-guessing. If there was any chance, even a remote one, she had to act now. She hurried into the living room, the floor creaking under her weight, and set the kitten on a towel near the fireplace. It looked impossibly small against the faded fabric, a scrap of wilderness misplaced in the order of her suburban home. Outside, wind battered the window panes, making the glass tremble as if the world itself were anxious for the outcome. A memory rose, unbidden and vivid. The old hospital, cold fluorescent lights, the relentless drone of monitors. She recalled a phrase burned into her mind by years of critical care. "You're not dead until you're warm and dead." It was a doctrine among those who fought to reclaim life from the margins, a reminder that hope sometimes required stubbornness bordering on madness. She clung to that thought as she knelt beside the kitten, pressing her palm against its chest again, willing her own warmth into its silent body. The kitten was nearly frozen solid. Its whiskers were coated with ice, the pads of its paws hard as little stones. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she realized just how close to death it was. Yet the faint pulse was still there, fluttering like the last leaf on a branch in winter. She grabbed a towel from the linen closet, rushing it over the kitten's body, careful not to shock it with too much heat all at once. She'd seen what rapid warming could do. cells exploding, the body rebelling against mercy. Everything had to be slow, controlled, gentle. The room filled with the crackle of fire and Maggie's own steady breathing. The rest of the world seemed impossibly distant. The neighbors' voices, the morning news, the calendar reminders she'd taped to the fridge. Nothing mattered except this frail, wild creature before her, and the possibility, however slim, of coaxing it back from the edge. She filled a bowl with lukewarm water, dipping a washcloth into it and wringing it out until it was just damp. Gently, she laid it over the kitten's body, careful to avoid its face. Every few moments, she shifted the towel, monitoring the animal's temperature with the back of her hand, watching for signs of life. A twitch of the whiskers, a quiver in the ear, anything. She murmured words she barely heard, not for comfort, but as a rhythm, a steadying metronome for her own nerves. There was no blueprint for this kind of rescue. Maggie had handled countless emergencies, but none quite like this. Saving a wild predator was a far cry from the controlled chaos of the ICU. The kitten's biology was a mystery, its needs impossible to know. She had to trust her training, her intuition, and that small, fierce hope she carried like a talisman. Minutes ticked by, each one lengthening into an eternity. The kitten remained unresponsive, its breathing shallow, a fragile thread holding it to the world. The neighborhood outside began to stir. A snowplow rumbled down the street. A dog barked behind a neighbor's fence. Still, Maggie stayed at her post, unwavering. The responsibility weighed on her. If she failed, it would be her fault. A life lost, however wild, because she'd tried and come up short. But if she did nothing, regret would follow her like a shadow, whispering what-ifs for the rest of her days. She looked down at the kitten's fur, its markings clear now that the ice was melting away. Beautiful, untamed. It was a miracle that such a creature had wandered into her life at all. Suddenly, a noise from the hallway, a neighbor's voice, muffled by distance, drifted through a crack in the door. "You're wasting your time, Maggie. It's just an animal. Don't get hurt." She heard the concern beneath the warning, but her resolve only hardened. This wasn't about winning approval or proving a point. It was about honoring the sliver of life still beating beneath her hands. Gently, she pressed a drop of warm water to the kitten's lips, watching as it dribbled down its chin. No swallow, but the action felt right. Like a bridge between the world of the living and the realm the kitten hovered above. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, it would be enough, but as the minutes stretched on, she realized the enormity of what she had undertaken. This wasn't a house cat, pliant and used to human touch. It was a wild predator, unpredictable, fragile, and, if she succeeded in reviving it, possibly dangerous. The kitten's claws were sheathed for now, but instinct could awaken with every heartbeat. Still, Maggie knew she'd already crossed the threshold. There was no turning back. Her own hands shook with adrenaline and cold as she cradled the kitten closer to the fire. The world outside felt far away, its judgment silenced by the urgency in her chest. Whatever happened next, life or death, gratitude or regret, she would face it. She had made her choice, and with it came a responsibility she could not surrender. With trembling hands, Maggie wrapped the kitten tighter in the towel, letting her own warmth seep into its tiny body. She settled onto the floor beside the fire, prepared to wait as long as it took, the old medical maxim echoing in her mind. Not dead until warm and dead. Not as long as there's a heartbeat. Somewhere in the swirl of fear and hope, Maggie Carter became more than a bystander. She was a lifeline, one stubborn heart refusing to let go. Hours seemed to slip away in the small living room as Maggie hovered between hope and dread. She could hear the ancient clock ticking on the mantel, the fire hissing and crackling, the world outside locked in silence beneath a heavy curtain of snow. The Bobcat Kitten lay on the old towel, impossibly still. Maggie's eyes rarely left it, searching for any flicker, a movement of whiskers, a shudder in its thin flanks, some subtle sign that life had claimed a foothold. She moved with practiced precision, recalling her days in the ICU. Every action was deliberate, methodical. She warmed thick towels by the fire, rotating them frequently so that no part of the kitten's body would be shocked by a sudden change in temperature. Too much heat, too soon, and the fragile balance she fought to preserve could shatter. She had seen it in patients, how easily hope could turn to heartbreak, how the best intentions could trigger disaster. Maggie made sure to keep the kitten near the fireplace, just far enough from the direct blaze to avoid burns, but close enough to let its core temperature rise slowly. She fetched an old medicine dropper from her bathroom cabinet, sterilized it, and filled it with warm water. Crouching beside the kitten, she tilted its head gently, letting a drop fall onto its lips. The water pooled and rolled off, at first ignored, but she persisted, repeating the process in slow, careful intervals. As time crawled forward, Maggie dared to believe her efforts might be working. The kitten's body, so stiff and cold before, began to show subtle signs of thawing. Its fur dried in patches, tiny muscles twitching beneath the skin, its tail curled inward ever so slightly, a hopeful echo of life returning. Maggie's heart surged. She whispered encouragement, not out loud but in her mind, speaking to the universe, to fate, to whatever force might still be listening after so many winters. She remembered the faces of patients she'd seen slip away, children and elders, loved ones clinging to hope until the very last. The memory of loss pressed in, but she forced herself to focus on the present, the here and now. Every moment demanded her full attention. Then, just as the tension in the room began to soften, disaster struck. The kitten, which had shown the first signs of life, suddenly went limp. Its shallow breaths, visible in the gentle rise and fall of its chest, faded. Its nose, pink and moist a moment before, turned a bluish hue, the color draining away as if blotted out by the cold. Panic surged through Maggie like an electric current. She reached for the kitten, heart pounding, hands trembling as she realized what was happening. The sudden change in temperature, the stress of revival, had overwhelmed the fragile system of the wild animal. Its nervous system, so much more delicate than any human's, was crashing. Maggie's mind raced through her training, searching for solutions, for some protocol. But all the manuals and textbooks fell away in the face of raw instinct. She was alone, just a woman and a dying animal, locked in a desperate fight against time and nature. She pressed her ear close to the kitten's mouth, searching for any sign of breath. There was nothing but silence, the faintest chill against her cheek. Panic flared, and with it came the ghosts of old failures. She remembered her last shift in the ICU years ago, when she had tried and failed to save a child no older than this kitten. How she had wept afterward, feeling the weight of a world she couldn't fix. That pain, that helplessness, threatened to pull her under now. But she resisted, clinging to the present. The world narrowed to the space between her hands. The house, the storm, the neighbors' warnings, even her own doubts, all faded into the background. She was left with the memory of all she'd learned: persistence, the stubborn refusal to give in, the knowledge that sometimes, against every odd, life could surprise you. With practiced calm, Maggie shifted the kitten gently, propping its head just so, her movements careful and confident, despite the tremor in her hands. She continued warming towels, massaging the animal's chest in tiny circles, doing everything she could to coax warmth and circulation back into its body. She forced herself to breathe slow and steady, the way she had instructed new nurses in times of crisis, letting her own calm fill the room. But the truth gnawed at her. The safety she'd hoped to create, the warm room, the steady fire, her nurturing hands, had only delivered the kitten to a new edge of danger. Every action, no matter how well-intentioned, could be a risk. She wondered if she'd been wrong, if the world's warnings had merit, if her own hope had blinded her to the reality that some things could not be saved. Still, she refused to stop. She rotated the kitten's body again, checking for a pulse, murmuring gentle encouragement even as despair began to set in. Outside, the wind howled louder, battering the windows as if urging her to surrender. The world seemed indifferent, ready to claim what little warmth remained in the room. Time stretched on, thick with anxiety. The kitten showed no sign of revival, its small form limp, breaths so shallow they might have been imagined. Maggie watched the firelight flicker over its fur, saw the outline of its wild ancestry, and felt the raw ache of hope and heartbreak mingling within her. She'd done everything she knew, given all she had, yet the outcome slipped further from her grasp with every passing second. Yet Maggie did not abandon her post. She kept vigil, her mind running through every scrap of knowledge, every memory of rescue and loss, every reason to hope even when hope seemed foolish. The crisis was real now, the stakes higher than ever. The kitten's fate hung in the balance, and so did something in Maggie herself, a need for redemption, a defiant will to save what the world deemed unsavable. In that tense, uncertain silence, Maggie Carter braced herself. This fight was not over. She would do everything in her power to bring the bobcat back, no matter how small the chance. For the kitten, for herself, for every lost hope she'd ever carried, she would keep trying, because sometimes that's all there is left. A sense of panic surged within Maggie as the bobcat kitten slipped further into stillness, its small body limp and its breaths vanished entirely. The room felt colder, the fire's glow suddenly distant and frail. Maggie forced her trembling hands to steady. Decades of experience on the ICU floor had conditioned her to act in the face of catastrophe, to move quickly and with purpose when lives teetered on the edge. She had seen this before, in infants, in the elderly, in those who'd lost their grip on the thread of life. But this time, the stakes felt both heavier and more fragile. The world outside her window was still wrapped in the hush of a blizzard, the roads likely impassable, help a distant dream. She was alone. The kitten's life depended on her alone. The memories of her final night in the ICU rushed back, vivid and unstoppable. The beeping monitors, the sterile taste of adrenaline, the small form of a child in crisis. She remembered the infant's parents, their desperate faces as they clung to hope, the weight of their sorrow when hope failed them. That pain had driven her to retire, but it had never left her. It lived in her hands, her dreams, in the way she saw the world, always searching for someone or something to save. With tears threatening to blur her vision, Maggie snapped into action. She laid the kitten flat on the towel, angling its head gently to open its airway. Her fingers, practiced and nimble despite age, began compressions, 2 fingers pressing rhythmically on the tiny chest. She counted silently, just as she had for years, her mind locked in the tunnel vision of crisis. 1, 2, 3, breathe. She brought her face close, sealing her lips gently over the kitten's small nose and mouth, breathing softly, barely enough to move its chest. The world shrank to this dance. Compress, breathe, hope. Each cycle seemed to last forever. Maggie's own breath became ragged, tears streaming down her face, hot tracks cutting through the chill on her cheeks. She whispered, not for the kitten, but for herself. Not again. Not this time. She could not bear the idea of failing again, not when hope flickered so close. Her hands shook, but she did not stop. Every time doubt threatened to slow her, she remembered the parents in the hospital, the lives she'd saved, the ones she'd lost. This kitten, wild and unknown, carried the weight of all those memories. The fire sputtered behind her. The clock on the mantel ticked. The snow battered the windows. Outside, the world spun indifferent to her battle. Inside, Maggie's will was the only shield the kitten had left. Minutes stretched into a suspended eternity. Her muscles screamed for rest, but she pressed on, ignoring the pain in her wrists, the burning in her lungs. She was trembling, crying openly, the tears and sweat indistinguishable as she bent again to breathe life into the little body. Again and again, she refused to stop, to let despair have the final word. Then, as if conjured by sheer stubbornness, she felt a sudden, subtle movement beneath her fingertips. The kitten's paw pressed faintly against the towel. At first, Maggie thought she'd imagined it, a phantom born of exhaustion and hope. But no, there it was again, a weak flex of the claws, a gasp that rattled through its body. The kitten's eyes fluttered open for a single wild heartbeat, pale gold staring blindly into the flickering light before they slid shut again. Its chest rose with a tiny, shallow breath. A sob burst from Maggie, relief and disbelief tangling together. She wrapped the kitten in a warm towel, tucking it close to her heart, not daring to move for fear of losing the fragile spark she'd kindled. The weight of the world lifted just a little as she felt the life in her hands. She rocked back on her heels, the kitten pressed to her chest, her own heart pounding as if it could will the wild thing back into the world. Yet even as she celebrated this victory, dread crept back in. The crisis was not over. Survival in this first hour meant nothing if the kitten could not last through the night. Its body was still fragile, its systems shocked by the ordeal. Maggie knew too well how a spark could flicker out after all her efforts. But she also knew what hope felt like. Tender, fierce, impossible. Night settled over Denver with a deeper chill. Maggie prepared a spot beside the fire, a fortress of warm towels and blankets. She nursed the Bobcat Kitten as best she could, monitoring its breaths, counting each one, refusing to let herself grow complacent. Every hour, she checked its pulse, pressed drops of water against its lips, and listened to the wind howl outside. She felt the fatigue of a long shift settling in, the ache of old wounds and new hopes, but she would not sleep, not while the kitten's fate was uncertain. She had promised herself, and something greater than herself, that she would not give up this time. As darkness deepened and the fire's glow cast trembling shadows across the room, Maggie kept watch, unwilling to surrender her vigil. She was a lifeline, a stubborn bulwark against a cold world. The Bobcat Kitten's survival was not guaranteed, But for tonight, hope endured, fragile, flickering, and alive in Maggie's care. As dawn crept into Maggie's living room, pale light filtering through frost-laced windows, the Bobcat Kitten was still alive. The small miracle of its survival through the night filled Maggie with cautious optimism. She could see the steady, shallow rise and fall of its chest, each breath fragile but determined. Exhausted but relieved, she allowed herself a rare moment of hope. It felt as if, for the first time in years, something had gone right. But hope, Maggie knew, could be treacherous. The kitten was far from safe. Its body remained limp, every muscle slack with weakness. Even as the room warmed and the fire burned bright, it seemed to struggle to hold on to the little warmth she could provide. Its eyes opened only briefly before sliding shut. Golden irises barely visible beneath heavy lids. She checked the clock. Nearly 24 hours since she'd found the kitten in the snow. The world outside had moved on. Neighbors digging out driveways, the muffled hum of snowplows clearing roads, children's laughter bouncing across icy lawns. But for Maggie, time stretched and bent around the kitten's fight for life. She barely noticed hunger, fatigue, or the ordinary rhythms of her house. The next challenge quickly made itself clear. The kitten needed nourishment. Maggie's stomach twisted at the thought. This was not a pet, not a kitten born to domestic life, but a wild animal. She recalled stories she'd read, instructions for wildlife rescues. Bobcat kittens, like all predators, could die of shock from the wrong kind of handling. They would not always tolerate being fed or touched, especially by humans. But there was no other choice. She rummaged through her medicine cabinet, searching for an old syringe, the kind she'd once used for feeding sick strays. With trembling hands, she warmed a small bowl of milk formula, testing its temperature against her wrist, making sure it was safe. She filled the syringe, her mind calculating every step. The kitten's mouth was so tiny, its jaw nearly locked shut. Gently, Maggie slipped the tip of the syringe to the edge of its lips and pressed a slow drop inside. At first, there was no reaction, no swallow, no flick of the tongue. She tried again, gentler this time, careful not to force too much. The kitten's whiskers twitched. Then, suddenly, its mouth snapped shut, tiny teeth clamping down with surprising strength. Maggie jerked her hand back, startled. In a blink, the kitten's paw shot out, claws catching her wrist. The scratch was shallow but sharp, and a bead of blood welled up on her skin. She sat back, startled not just by the pain, but by what it meant. The bobcat's instincts were intact. Even half-frozen, half-starved, the wild thing inside it fought back. This was no puppy or house cat. This was a creature of the woods, built for survival on its own terms. Maggie smiled, despite the sting in her arm. A fierce thing, she thought. A survivor. But the challenge remained. The kitten's wildness was both a blessing and a risk. If it couldn't feed, it would die. If it lashed out too violently, it might hurt itself or her. Maggie took a deep breath, finding her center the way she had in countless emergencies. She adjusted her strategy, warming the formula a little more, trying a different angle, waiting for the kitten to show some sign it was ready. Hours passed in slow, careful intervals. Maggie alternated between offering warmth, a drop of formula, and letting the kitten rest. She watched for every sign, a swallow, a twitch, a faint sound. Bit by bit, the kitten accepted a few drops, though its appetite remained weak. Maggie persisted, her patience honed by years of tending the fragile, the fearful, the almost lost. Through it all, she became acutely aware that she was acting out of instinct and love, but also crossing into dangerous territory. The kitten was wild, untamable by nature. No matter how gentle she was, no matter how much care she provided, it could never truly belong here. The moment it recovered its strength, its instincts would sharpen. Its trust, if it ever came, would be fragile at best. That realization brought Maggie to a new understanding. Her job was not only to keep the kitten alive right now, but to plan for its future, one she could not provide. Reacting was no longer enough. She had to think ahead, find a way to stabilize the bobcat and connect with someone who could offer the specialized care it needed. She would need to reach out to a wildlife rescue center, to trust the experts she'd never met, and let go. The thought filled her with both dread and relief. She had spent her whole life in the thick of crises, answering emergencies one breath at a time. But this required faith. Faith in the wild, faith in strangers, faith in the possibility that sometimes the best way to love was to let go. By evening, the kitten had taken a little more formula, its body a touch warmer, its eyes open for longer stretches. Its movements grew steadier, and it even managed a weak hiss when Maggie approached with the syringe. A sound so defiant that Maggie laughed, wiping away a tear. She watched it for a long while, the fire casting gold over its rosetted fur, before picking up the phone and searching for the number of a wildlife rescue center. She knew what she had to do. The battle for the kitten's survival was not over, but it was shifting. It was no longer just about saving it in this moment. It was about finding it a future in the world it was born to, a future that, for all her love, Maggie could never truly provide. After her decision to call a wildlife rescue center, Maggie felt a shift inside herself, a blend of purpose and anxiety. She gathered old blankets and repurposed her finished basement, transforming it into a makeshift intensive care unit. It wasn't much, but it was what she could do. She set up heating pads, a portable space heater, and a collection of towels she rotated by the fireplace. There, in the dim light, with concrete floors chilled by the winter storm above, she created a small, protected world where the Bobcat Kitten could recover without fear of sudden movement, barking dogs, or the relentless curiosity of neighbors. She placed the kitten's nest in a sturdy box lined with rags and warmed rice socks, careful to leave an opening for air. She kept the radio low, the hum of soft music serving as a kind of white noise against the wind howling outside. Maggie worked methodically, washing her hands before every interaction, monitoring the kitten's temperature and pulse, administering tiny feeds of formula, and jotting down notes in an old notebook about every tremor, twitch, and change in the animal's condition. It was as if her old training had taken over, her mind clear and sharp, her hands steady, her exhaustion forgotten. But as the day wore on, the weather outside turned from threatening to catastrophic. The snow piled higher, burying fence posts and erasing the paths she'd worn into the backyard. By evening, the sky had turned a sickly shade of gray, and the wind howled louder, rattling every window pane in her house. Maggie checked the forecast on her phone. A blizzard warning, temperatures expected to drop even lower, whiteout conditions across Denver. She checked her supplies. Enough food for herself and the kitten, plenty of firewood, extra propane canisters for the camping stove she kept for emergencies. She felt ready, or as ready as anyone could be in a storm like this. Then, suddenly everything changed. The lights flickered, dimmed, and then died, leaving the house in deepening shadow. The refrigerator's hum faded. The heating system coughed and fell silent. She stood still for a moment, listening to the hush, the storm raging outside, the eerie silence within. The power grid had failed. A cold dread gripped Maggie. The house would become an icebox within hours, and her makeshift ICU was suddenly no better than the frozen world outside. She ran to the basement, grabbing her flashlight, and checked the kitten's box. The little body trembled, nostrils flaring as it struggled to maintain any heat at all. Without power, everything she'd done, the blankets, the heating pads, the carefully regulated warmth, was at risk of being undone in a single night. Maggie's training had taught her about hypothermia, about the danger of sudden drops in body temperature, but experience also taught her the power of improvisation. She didn't hesitate. She slipped on her heaviest coat, scooped the kitten, blankets and all, into her arms, and made her way to the kitchen, where her camping stove and a single tank of propane waited on the counter. She fired it up, a small blue flame flickering defiantly against the cold. Then she sat on the floor, back pressed to a cupboard, the kitten wrapped in her coat, nestled against her chest for warmth. For hours, Maggie remained in that position, barely moving, her body a living furnace for the tiny animal. She rotated the kitten's blankets near the stove's flame, careful not to scorch them, then swapped them out as soon as they cooled. The house around her seemed to groan and shrink with the cold, every window a patchwork of ice, every floorboard cold to the touch. Her own fingers turned numb, her feet like blocks of wood inside her boots. The night stretched on, a test of willpower. Maggie sang softly to herself, old lullabies and snatches of folk songs she remembered from her childhood, trying to stay awake. Every hour, she checked the kitten's pulse, feeling the rapid, thread-like beat beneath her fingers. Sometimes, the bobcat's breathing slowed so much, she had to rouse it with a gentle rub on the chest, whispering words of encouragement just to herself and to the wild thing curled against her heart. Outside, the storm howled even louder, snow piling higher against the house, cutting it off from the world. The isolation was nearly complete. Maggie's phone battery faded, her sense of time growing fuzzy as exhaustion pulled at her, but she never let herself fully rest. She was all the warmth and hope the kitten had left. Near dawn, as the darkness began to turn blue at the edges, the cold intensified. The propane finally sputtered and died, the last of the stored heat leaking into the world. Maggie felt her strength ebbing, her hands shaking with fatigue and chill. She checked the kitten. Its heart was beating, but slower now, so slow it almost seemed to stop between pulses. Panic fluttered in her chest. She gathered the last of her strength, pressing the kitten tighter against her skin, wrapping both of them in every blanket she could find. Maggie whispered, "Hold on." But her words were only steam in the freezing air. She rocked back and forth, desperate to transfer every ounce of her own heat, her own stubborn will to survive, into the tiny, wild life depending on her. She could feel herself fading, every breath an effort, every heartbeat a question mark. The blizzard roared on. Maggie's world narrowed to the circle of light from her dying flashlight and the steady, tenuous rise and fall of the kitten's chest. She did not know if they would both make it through the endless, frozen night. But she refused to surrender, not to the storm, not to despair, not to the cold that clawed at her bones. She was the last line of defense, the living shield. If hope meant sacrifice, she would give everything she had. And so, in the dark, with the storm howling and the world frozen around her, Maggie Carter kept her vigil, her love, her strength, her warmth, the only thing standing between life and death for both herself and the wild thing in her arms. As the storm's fury dragged on, The walls of Maggie's house seemed to shrink around her. The once cozy kitchen, now shrouded in darkness, was an island in a hostile sea of ice. Maggie huddled near the silent stove, the Bobcat Kitten pressed against her chest, beneath the folds of every blanket and coat she could muster. Each hour felt impossibly long, her own body trembling as she fought exhaustion and cold. It was a battle of attrition, against time, against the elements, against the creeping fear that this might be the end for both of them. The propane had run out just before dawn, leaving only the faintest memory of warmth in the air. With the power out, the house felt more like a cave carved into the side of a glacier than a suburban home. Maggie could see her breath, little clouds blooming with every exhale. Her hands were stiff, every movement slow and deliberate as she continued to check on the kitten, feeling for that precious, erratic heartbeat. Outside, the storm still raged. The windows were layered with frost so thick they blocked even the weakest dawn light. The world beyond might have vanished, erased by wind and white. Maggie's phone was dead now. Her clocks stopped, time measured only by the steady rise and fall of the kitten's breath and the ragged rhythm of her own. She knew she was reaching her limits. Every muscle ached, every joint screamed. Her skin stung where cold found its way through the seams in her clothing. Her mind wandered to the faces she'd known in the ICU, patients who had hovered on the brink, some returning, some slipping away. She remembered the old tricks, the resourcefulness learned from years on the job, when medical miracles sometimes came down to clever improvisation and sheer, unyielding will. The kitten was growing weaker, its breaths shallow and far between, eyes closed in a fitful sleep. Its ears and tail felt cold, limp, the little paws barely twitching when she touched them. Maggie's own heartbeat thundered with panic, but she forced herself to remain calm. She could not afford to lose focus now. She dug through her emergency supplies and remembered something she'd learned long ago, a trick from the ICU for hypothermic patients when resources were scarce. Warming IVs, they had called it, heating saline bags in boiling water to provide gradual warmth from the inside out. She had no IVs, but the principle was the same. She set to work, boiling water on the last remaining heat from the camping stove, soaking towels and wringing them out until they were steaming. She wrapped them, layer upon layer, around the kitten, always careful not to burn, only to coax the temperature up, bit by bit. She pressed her own body close, synchronizing her breathing with the kitten's, trying to create a rhythm, a lifeline in the cold. It became a ritual. Warm the towel, swap it out, check the pulse, whisper encouragements into the hush. The night ebbed and flowed, and Maggie's world reduced to this heartbeat by heartbeat struggle. The hours crawled by, every minute a battle. Her mind played tricks in the half-light. She saw visions from her past, faces of colleagues, flashes of other cold, desperate nights. She remembered the stubbornness it took to keep hope alive when reason said to give up. That same stubbornness filled her now, driving her to keep moving, to keep fighting, even as her eyelids grew heavy and her fingers numb. And then, at the ragged edge of dawn, as the snowstorm finally began to lose its grip, a change. The kitten, whose body had been so limp and still, twitched more strongly. Its eyes fluttered open, wild and golden, searching the dimness before settling on Maggie's face. Its breathing, shallow and halting before, became a little steadier, its ribs moving with a more regular cadence. Maggie felt a surge of energy, her exhaustion forgotten for a moment. She watched as the kitten lifted its head, weak but determined, and let out a sound that was halfway between a growl and a mewl. It was the music of life, a sound that filled the silent house with hope. Slowly, the color returned to the kitten's nose and paws. Maggie could feel the warmth returning to its body, her own chest aching with relief and gratitude. She kept up her vigil through the early morning, not daring to let down her guard. The storm outside finally faded, snow drifting in great white waves against the house. But inside, the fight was being won. The fire in the living room sputtered back to life as the power returned with a hum. Heat began to seep into the rooms, pushing back against the frost. Maggie wept, soft, tired tears of victory. Not luck, but skill, grit, and a heart unwilling to surrender had brought them both through the night. She stroked the kitten's fur, feeling it purr faintly. A wildness and a gratitude mingled in its fragile heartbeat. For the first time since she had found the little bobcat in the snow, Maggie allowed herself to believe they might both be okay. The dawn was theirs. They had survived the storm, together. When the storm finally relented and the house began to thaw, Maggie slumped against the kitchen cabinets, utterly spent. The bobcat kitten nestled beside her, swaddled in warmed towels and fleece. For a long time she didn't move, letting the returning hum of the furnace and the soft tick of the thermostat wash over her like a half-remembered song. The tension that had lived in her shoulders for 2 days finally began to dissolve, replaced by a deep, marrow-level ache of exhaustion. Her arms bore fresh scratches, narrow, angry red lines from the kitten's desperate swats as it grew stronger and more alert. Her skin was puffy and bruised in places, a patchwork of effort and survival. Maggie barely registered the discomfort. She looked at the wild creature in her care, saw its golden eyes shining with cautious life, and knew the pain was a small price. Even now, the kitten would arch its back or hiss softly when startled, reminding her that some instincts never faded, no matter how fragile the body. Maggie forced herself upright, moving through her battered house like a ghost, checking for storm damage and setting things right. She refilled the kitten's water, wiped away bits of half-melted snow near the door, and opened a window a crack to let in a sliver of sun. The world outside was changed. Mounds of snow glinted under a sky so blue it hurt the eyes. Neighbors emerged in small knots, talking in low, relieved voices, waving to Maggie as they shoveled driveways or checked fences. She returned their greetings with a tired nod, her mind fixed on the wild thing sleeping in the box by the heater. Days passed in a haze of slow healing and vigilance. The bobcat began to move with a little more strength each morning, stretching and testing the limits of its tiny enclosure. Maggie worked methodically, feeding it at careful intervals, keeping it warm, tracking its weight and temperature in her notebook. Every improvement, a longer nap, a louder mew, a quicker reaction, brought a surge of pride. But the cost was visible. Maggie's sleep was fitful, her appetite thin. Each night she listened for changes in the kitten's breathing, waking at the smallest noise. The rhythms of caregiving returned, old habits layered over new worries. The sense of responsibility pressed on her like the weight of snow on the roof. She knew she could not keep the kitten forever. As it recovered, the wildness in its eyes grew sharper. Sometimes it would shrink from her touch or bite at the towel, restless and quick. Maggie saw what she had always known. The bobcat did not belong to her world. The house, with its gentle warmth and human scents, was a temporary shelter. The wild called to the kitten, even as it lay trembling and weak in her care. One morning, Maggie picked up the phone and dialed the number she'd scribbled on a notepad days before. Her voice was steady but low as she spoke to the Wildlife Rescue Center, explaining everything: where she found the kitten, what she'd done, its gradual progress. The rescue workers' tone was calm, professional, tinged with awe. They had heard stories of survival, but rarely one that began with such odds. They agreed to take the bobcat, documenting every detail of its recovery as a case of near-miraculous neurological resilience after severe hypothermia. When the day came to let go, Maggie readied herself with the same steady resolve she had brought to every step of the ordeal. She wrapped the kitten in soft blankets and carried it to her car, the box secured beside her. The drive to the center was quiet. Maggie's mind a tangle of relief and grief, gratitude and worry. She remembered all the faces she'd watched slip away over the years, all the hands she had held, the moments when she'd had to say goodbye. She knew this farewell was different, but no less profound. At the center, a team of wildlife experts greeted her. They examined the kitten carefully, marveling at its recovery. Their hands were steady, their questions gentle but precise. Maggie answered everything, passing on her notebook, her instructions, her hard-won wisdom. She watched as the kitten was transferred to a quiet, sunlit enclosure with branches and stones, a place that mimicked the woods it would one day return to. The parting was painful in its simplicity. Maggie lingered by the door, watching the kitten explore its new world. It turned back once, pressing its paw against the glass, golden eyes searching hers. Maggie smiled, swallowing a sob. She whispered a silent promise: to let go, to trust, to believe in the wildness that had survived despite every hardship. In the days that followed, the rescue center kept her updated. The bobcat adapted quickly, regaining its weight, learning to hunt and climb. The story of its survival spread. Neighbors, local news, and even distant strangers were moved by the tale of a stubborn retired nurse and a wild thing that refused to die. Maggie found herself answering calls, receiving cards, and hearing gratitude from people she'd never met. But for Maggie, the cost lingered: aching bones, sleepless nights, the invisible wounds of loving and letting go. She realized she had given everything she could, and now the rest belonged to fate and the forest. The kitten's life was not hers to keep, but she'd played her part in its improbable survival. With every dawn, Maggie felt lighter. The house grew quiet again, her routines returned, but the lesson endured, etched into every moment. Sometimes love means letting go, and the hardest battles are fought with patience, sacrifice, and faith in the wild. The weeks after the bobcat kitten left for the Wildlife Center felt strangely quiet. Maggie's home, once alive with anxious energy, had settled back into its ordinary rhythms: the tick of the mantel clock, the distant rumble of snowplows, the hush that lingers after a storm. The old towels were washed and folded, the basement cleared of blankets and rice socks, yet Maggie could still feel the echo of those long, frozen nights. Sometimes she would pause in the kitchen, gaze at the patch of floor where she had huddled with the wild thing clutched to her chest, and marvel at the strange alchemy of fear and hope that had gotten them both through. Winter began to loosen its grip on Denver. The sky turned a cleaner blue. Snowbanks melted to reveal damp brown earth, and tiny shoots of grass pressed upward in the yard. Maggie let the sunlight in, moving more slowly than before. Her body still marked by fatigue, but her heart somehow lighter. She kept in touch with the Wildlife Center. Her calls met with cheerful updates. He's putting on weight. His coordination is coming back. He's taken his first swipe at a live mouse. Each bit of news brought a private surge of joy. Maggie imagined the bobcat, stronger every day, discovering what it meant to be wild again, unburdened by memory or gratitude. Months slipped by. Maggie found herself talking about the ordeal only rarely, and never in full detail. She had always been a private person, the kind who preferred to show care through action rather than words. Yet sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, she found herself replaying those harrowing hours, the frantic improvisation, the ache in her arms, the silent plea that life would hold on just a little longer. She realized she was changed by the ordeal. The wounds on her skin had healed, but her spirit bore a gentler scar, a mark of the night she refused to give up. Spring arrived with a rush, trees budding and robins returning. One afternoon, Maggie received an invitation from the Wildlife Center. The bobcat was ready for visitors. He was too wild for direct contact, but they welcomed her to observe him in the outdoor enclosure, a step away from release into a protected forest reserve. Maggie agreed, her heart pounding with anticipation and uncertainty. The center was nestled on the edge of a wooded park. The hum of the city faded to birdsong and wind in the pines. Maggie drove there under a sky scrubbed clean by spring rain, her hands tense on the steering wheel. She parked and walked the familiar path, greeted by the staff with warmth and gratitude. They led her quietly to the enclosure, where the bobcat, no longer a kitten, paced along the fence line, powerful and lean, his rosetted coat gleaming in the sun. Maggie stood in silence, heart swelling with pride and melancholy. The bobcat paused, catching her scent. He approached the mesh, head high, golden eyes fixed on hers. For a breathless moment, time seemed to stop. He pressed his paw lightly to the bars, claws sheathed, a wild and wordless gesture of recognition, or perhaps simply curiosity. Maggie smiled through tears, feeling the fullness of the journey between them, the nights of terror and hope, the narrow thread of survival. She realized then what had always been true. Her role was not to tame or possess, but to fight for life when no one else would, to hold the line when hope faltered. True love, she saw, was not about keeping something close. It was about letting go when the time came, about recognizing that every fragile thing belongs to the world, not to the hands that nurture it for a time. She left the center lighter than she had arrived. On the way home, she rolled the window down and breathed in the scent of damp earth and pine needles, the world buzzing with new life. She thought about the lesson that had grown inside her, slow and persistent as a seed in winter. Life is fragile, but sometimes one person's refusal to give up can change everything. Back at home, Maggie returned to her routines, but something had shifted. She found herself more patient, with herself, with others, even with the aches that lingered in her bones. When neighbors asked about the bobcat, she shared only what mattered most. The wild thing had survived, and would one day run free. In the evenings, she would sit on her porch, watching dusk gather in the yard, listening for the distant call of birds and the quiet song of wind in the trees. Sometimes, she imagined the bobcat stalking the edge of some forest, strong and sure, a shadow among shadows. She felt no regret, only a quiet gratitude for the chance to bear witness to his wildness, to have played her part in a story larger than herself. The core lesson, etched in her heart and in every breath she took, was simple and profound. Life is fragile, but sometimes one person's refusal to give up can change everything. Maggie carried it forward, a lantern against the dark, and knew she would never again doubt the power of hope, even in the coldest winter. With spring in full bloom, Maggie's life settled into a new normal, a rhythm marked by a deeper appreciation for the quiet, ordinary moments that had once slipped by unnoticed. She moved through her days with a gentler patience, tending to her garden, waving to neighbors, and sipping coffee by the window that faced the woods. The memory of the storm, the endless cold, and the fragile bobcat kitten had settled within her, not as a shadow, but as a soft and steady light. The story of Maggie and the wild kitten had rippled through the neighborhood and beyond, quietly at first, then gathering strength like the rising sun. A neighbor mentioned it to another at the grocery store. Someone else wrote a post in a local online forum. The Wildlife Rescue Center included the tale in their newsletter, and soon word spread further, crossing fences, backyards, and even city lines. People began stopping Maggie in the street, thanking her, asking about the bobcat. She always answered with humility, never taking full credit, always pointing to the wild creature's own stubborn will to live. One evening, Maggie received an invitation to speak at the local town hall. The center director called her, explaining they were hosting a community gathering to celebrate stories of compassion and resilience, stories that might remind people that hope is rarely wasted and that every act of kindness, however small, can ripple outward in unexpected ways. Maggie hesitated at first. She had never liked public speaking, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves. But the memory of that desperate, freezing night, how alone and uncertain she'd felt, reminded her of the power of sharing stories, of letting others know they were not alone in their struggles. On the night of the event, Maggie stood backstage, smoothing the creases in her dress. She heard the gentle murmur of a crowd gathering, felt the weight of anticipation in the air. The hall was full. Friends, neighbors, people she had never met, and even a few children from the local school, eyes bright with curiosity. She gripped the edges of the podium, her notes forgotten, heart pounding as she gazed out at the sea of expectant faces. For a moment, Maggie was transported back to the night of the storm, to the ache in her arms and the weight of the wild thing pressed to her heart. The memory filled her with both strength and humility. She took a slow breath and began. She spoke not just of the crisis, the blizzard, the failed power, the relentless cold, but of the fear that had threatened to overwhelm her, the doubts that nearly convinced her to give up. She described the frailty of the kitten, the countless times she'd been sure it would not survive, and the stubborn hope that had kept her going minute by minute, heartbeat by heartbeat. Tears glimmered in the audience as she shared the mantra she'd learned in her years as a nurse. You're not dead until you're warm and dead. She explained how it applied not only to bodies in crisis, but to every moment when despair whispered that hope was lost, that there was no point in trying. She spoke about the power of refusing to give up, not because success was certain, but because sometimes a single act of compassion could make all the difference. The hall was quiet as she finished, her voice trembling only slightly. She looked out and saw wet eyes, bowed heads, hands held tight. For the first time, Maggie felt the resonance of her story not as her own, but as a thread connecting her to everyone in the room, each person carrying memories of struggle, moments when hope seemed impossible, times when the world told them to surrender, but their hearts whispered, "Keep going." The center director stepped forward and thanked Maggie, then offered the microphone to the audience. One by one, people stood and shared their own stories of caring for a wounded bird, rescuing a stray dog, sitting through sleepless nights with a sick child or an aging parent. Each account was different, Yet every voice carried the same stubborn courage, the same fragile hope that had kept Maggie kneeling in the snow beside the dying bobcat. Afterward, people lingered to speak with her, thanking her for reminding them of their own strength. Maggie shook hands, exchanged hugs, and listened as others confided their moments of doubt and perseverance. She realized, as the night wore on, that the story she had lived was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever refused to let go when the world turned cold, everyone who had chosen hope over surrender. The next day, the Wildlife Center published the story online, adding a call to action for the whole community. Have you ever faced a moment when everyone said, "Give up," but your heart whispered, "Keep going"? What choice did you make? Share your story below. The comment section filled with responses. Some short, some sprawling, all honest and raw. People from across the city and beyond wrote about the animals they'd saved, the family members they'd comforted, the battles they'd fought in silence. Maggie read everyone. She felt a kinship with each story, a sense of unity in the shared vulnerability and strength. She replied to as many as she could, offering encouragement and thanks. It became a kind of quiet mission, showing others that their struggles and their hope mattered. Days became weeks, and the world slipped easily into summer. Maggie tended her garden, watched the sun set through her kitchen window, and sometimes, late at night, she would walk to the edge of the woods, listening for the distant sounds of wildlife. She liked to imagine the bobcat, now fully grown, roaming free, no longer tethered to her care, but forever changed by their brief, fierce bond. In those moments, Maggie felt a peace she had never known in her decades of nursing or in all the storms she'd weathered. She understood that saving a life was never a solitary act. It was a thread spun from the courage of one heart and woven through a whole community, each person taking a turn, holding hope against the dark. And she knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had fought for life and learned to let go, that there is always a reason to keep going, always another fragile heartbeat waiting for one more chance.